Hey, IB Environmental students. Today we're going to be talking about sustainability and natural capital, the second podcast in topic 3.2. Let's begin. First, we're going to review some of the things we might have talked about in class or have hinted at, which is related to a nation's wealth. Nation's wealth is going to be related to the following components: produced assets, natural capital, and human resources. Produced assets might be timber, natural capital might be the forest that timber comes from, and the human resources could refer to the types of skills and related education and number of humans that might be available to produce that timber. All these things are going to complement each other and are interrelated. Not only that, depending on how much of each of these things that might be involved in the well-being or the standards of living in that location. And lastly, the dominant source of one of those types of components might vary depending on the amount of materials in that location, as well as how developed the location is. So here we can look at this figure, and we can see that a lot of this can vary what's the dominant one of these components. We don't need to know these that in depth, but it's not a bad idea to just peek at them. Let's look at some different figures related to measuring wealth. You don't need to be able to calculate these things, but you need to understand what they are and what they're used for. So GNP refers to the gross national product. It is the sum of the goods and the services produced in a country. It is a really good economic factor that relates to health and wealth of a country. The second variable is GDP, which is the GNP minus the net income from abroad. This is also going to be able to help us compare the wealthier or the poorer countries. Think MEDC or LEDC. It is going to be related to the depreciation in materials, but it is not going to be related to the depreciation of natural capital. Remember, a lot of nature doesn't have a value set on it. We don't necessarily have a value on our wetlands for how they help with flood control or how they filter our pollutants. So those things are not necessarily accounted for, but more of our formal different materials are usually accounted for, like how much food are we producing as a location. Let's look at an example of how this might affect a location. So for instance, let's say a country cuts down 1 million acres of a forest, and then we see a positive income on the side of timber sales, which is wonderful. That's a formal value that we can set on it economically, but only depreciation is accounted for in how it affects the chainsaws and the trucks that were involved in cutting the timber. So that's like material costs. We might need more chainsaws or more trucks depending on how much we break them down. But what kind of natural services might be lost by cutting down a big forest? Well, we haven't necessarily accounted for the fact that that forest might prevent erosion, or that forest is a giant carbon storage that is going to help with climate. These situations might lead to a high undervaluing of those natural resources, because we're going to cut that timber really fast because we're not accounting for all those things that wood and the forest, if it was intact, would do for us as humans and wildlife in general. So because of this factor, we use this term sustainability. Sustainability is going to refer to living within the means of nature on the interest or sustainable income generated by natural capital. This is pretty hard to understand, so let's get an alternate looking at this. So a society supporting themselves by depleting essential forms of natural capital is unsustainable. So this is not sustainable. This is sustainable. Let's look at it in a different way. To be sustainable, a harvest or a degradation of a natural capital should not exceed the rates of that capital renewing. So I cannot cut down a forest more than the forest will grow within that time period. Otherwise, I'm depleting more and past the stock of that location. So because this has been a problem, because different locations are in different demographic transitions, the UN has created this new phrase, the sustainable development. This is development that meets the current needs of the populace, thinking standards of living and so forth, without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So think tragedy of the commons. I don't want to deplete any resources or destroy the environment so that future generations won't be able to have the same standards of living as us. This thinking led to Earth summits from 1992 till present. So let's talk about a couple of them. The first one was called Rio de Janeiro, which was in Brazil. It was a conference on the environment and development. Notice I've kind of abbreviated that to save some room. This was in 1992. This was very groundbreaking because it was the first time that the world had really thought about environmental problems being international problems. A lot of our commons, like the ocean and the air, we weren't thinking about what we do in the U.S. potentially affecting what happens in China and so forth. So this was the first time that on a global scale, people were talking about population, habitat destruction, loss of biodiversity. And because of these things, the definition of sustainable development was very much at the forefront. And because of that, this agenda occurred called Agenda 21, which was a focus on sustainable development for the 21st century. That's why we call it Agenda 21. They wanted to reconcile the future economic development as locations go through demographic transition with environmental protection in mind. So how can we industrialize and even go past industrialization to post-industrialized to being a very stable populace without destroying the environment in the process. This is very difficult because in getting the standard of living of the United States, we make a lot of trash. We have a terrible carbon footprint, and other places want the same things we want. But they are doing it fast, so they're not always thinking about how it's affecting the environment, and neither are we sometimes. So because this was a big deal and it's not going to be solved that quickly, there was a second World Summit on Sustainable Development that happened in Johannesburg in 2002, and then even more recently, and more famous, was the Rio 20 Earth Summit, but checked in 20 years later to see how well are we doing on our progress for sustainable development. In class, we're going to look at a couple cool case studies where they follow different kids throughout the 20 years between the first Earth Summit and the second one, seeing was sustainable development happening in that location. Lastly, to do sustainable development, we also have to describe, well, what would be a sustainable amount of natural capital to take out, which is called sustainable yield. So sustainable yield is the rate of increase in natural stock, amount to exploit without depleting the initial stock or potential replenishment. So notice in this graph, between these 2 years, there's been a surplus or growth or renewal or replenishment that will allow us to be able to take some of the stock without depleting past the original amount. So if we were to take this, and let's say this was timber, if we were to harvest it, we would only want to harvest this part that's darker colored because that would be sustainable. We're not going past the original stock amount. So for a crop, this is the gain in biomass or energy, and sometimes that is referred to growth or recruitment or production of offspring. So think about if it was fish, this would be the extra offspring that were potentially made in that time. This is a little difficult. We do have a little bit of a complex equation for this that is on your objective sheet, and we will talk about this more in class. Great job, guys. See you next time.